Jason says he'll be joining in a minute. It was a lovely rainy day here in New Orleans. We had to speak to a class from Vassar. It was a lot of fun. Via Zoom. Grab something for a second. All right, where's Jason? There's Jason. Hello.
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 How are you?
I'm doing well. The mustache is nice.
Thanks. It's Sarah gave me this like Echo and the Bunnymen haircut, but then I gave myself a Sparks mustache.
I thought you were going to say she gave you the mustache as a nice gift.
Yeah. While I was sleeping, she carved it in.
I
How are
see
you
that.
doing? Is
I'm doing well.
weather there?
It's cold. It was snowing this morning. It's been really strange. It was snowing for a good 10 minutes today. I think it's like 48 right now.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's been weird.
In Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn.
My God. I thought maybe you were like upstate or something.
No.
Huh.
No, it's been weird. It's been like some days will be 70 and then,
Yeah.
but global warming is a liberal conspiracy, so
Yeah. It's a conspiracy to make sure that people like you don't get to wear lovely cable knit sweaters anymore.
right, yeah. They're trying to take our coziness away.
It's the anti-hygge front.
Yeah, that's going to be like, I'm going to get really right-leaning, and my whole thing is just going to be like, I demand coziness. It's a way of life. You can't take my coziness away.
Yeah, that's good. I feel like
yeah.
you could have a strong following for that.
Yeah, I got the look.
You do. You look very cozy.
Yeah.
I feel like
Thank you.
I could curl up in your beard.
Yeah, very Paddington-esque.
Oh, yeah. Do you use products in your beard, like something, oils and such?
I do. I don't use them. My barber, I actually get my beard done every 2 weeks. I haven't for a few weeks, but obviously. But I tell people all the time, I'm like, if you want to have a good beard, pay somebody to take care of it.
Right.
but I've been using this stuff that's literally called Dude. It smells. It's like sandalwood and something else. But I was like, I'm not gonna put something on my. I hate the whole like masculine. Like we have to sell guys like facial creams and all these things, but make it like for men.
Yeah. You can't call it moisturizer. We have to call it like shielding.
Yeah, right. And I'm always kind of embarrassed by that, so I try to like stay away from those things. But my barber put it on, and I was like, oh, that's really nice. It works. Yeah. So that's really it, though. Otherwise, it's just decades of running from just Russian soldiers and freezing in the Carpathian Mountains. Just decades of suffering led to this.
Is this the longest you've ever had it?
No. There's a photo. I mean, one year I went out of the country and I let it grow for like months and months and months. And that was when I wasn't really taking care of it as much. But then 2 years ago, this is like the Emily and I got stuck. My wife and I got stuck on a Caribbean island for
Oh, I
like
thought you were going to take a
10
cruise ship.
extra days. Yeah, that's how I wrote my famous essay, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again.
Oh, okay.
Um, I wrote that.
Uh-huh.
But no, it was we got stuck on this Caribbean island during our holiday, and I just let it keep growing, and I was like, wow, this is a real look. And I started like drinking everything out of a coconut and had a
Did you
Panama hat.
did you call yourself Robinson Crusoe?
No, that would have been good though. I really wish I would have thought. No, I mean, I made up whenever I go on vacation, I always make up these like personas for myself. Like,
Really?
I think at that time I was telling people like on Instagram I was doing it, but Emily and I were starting to take it a step further and make jokes about it when we go out to bars. I was telling people like I had an album recorded by Dennis Wilson in the 1970s that nobody's ever heard of. Just like telling people shit like that, even though I wasn't born in the 1970s. But people seemed interested nonetheless. So,
It's like what kids do at sleepaway camp in the summer, right? They just make up shit about what their life is like during the real year.
yeah, and it's
Did
just
you ever
sort of
do
like
that?
no, not really. I think my problem with summer camp was I was too honest. Like I remember like being 7 or 8 and telling kids at summer camp that my favorite band was the Supremes, and
Okay.
like the next day, all the kids were like, they started making fun of me because I guess like one of the counselors told them I was gay because my favorite band was the Supremes, and I was like, I don't know what's wrong with that, but okay.
Yeah.
So I think I was just
That's
too
amazing.
honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my
I
love, my
remember
deep
this
love
is
and soul.
this is a total digression, but I had there was a kid at school. I'm going to tell a story for a minute if you don't mind. There
Yeah.
was a kid at school who came up to me one day and said, "Hey, do you like MC Hammer?" And I was in second grade or something. And I was like, I don't know. And he goes, "You better find out about MC Hammer, or I'm going to beat you up tomorrow." So I went home and I was like, "Mom, what's MC Hammer?" And she's like, "I don't know. Ask your dad." And I was like, "Dad, what's MC Hammer?" He's like, "I don't know. Ask your mom." So I went in the next day and I was like, "I didn't learn anything about MC Hammer." And he like slapped me and went away. But he kept torturing me for a while. I eventually found out who MC Hammer was, and I asked my uncle Gad, who's an Israeli guy, a friend of my father, if he would buy me an MC Hammer tape. And he bought me Too Legit to Quit over like spring break. And so I listened to it, and I remember the whole hand gesture thing, the Too Legit,
Yeah.
Too Legit
Oh yeah,
to Quit.
yeah, I remember that. I know that still.
And I like went into school and I was like, got the MC Hammer tape, Too Legit to Quit. And the guy like slapped me and grabbed the tape and walked away. So that was when
Wow.
I guess that was when I learned not to try to be too cool. It's an important life lesson. Not to try
I
too
just
hard.
remember I remember this kid named Brian, this like kind of bully who I did not like. I've always looked a little bit bigger than I am. Like I have a build. Even when I was a kid, I was kind of so people didn't really mess with me too much. But I was always scared of this one kid, and he was like, "Are you a Metallica fan or a GNR fan?" And I was like, I don't like. Deep down, I didn't like either of them at the time.
Right.
I just said Guns N' Roses, and he called me a homophobic slur and said wrong answer and punched me in the stomach and walked away. And I was like, Jesus. So that was like I just need to learn to like lie better, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was
I
really.
wonder what those guys are doing now.
Oh, I know what they're doing.
They're Bernie Bros.
No, not even. They're
They're
like
like,
deep in the Chicago suburbs.
Yeah.
Just
Speaking of
with
the
their
Chicago
poor
suburbs,
kids.
your new book, you just got the galley copies. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you tell me about it? The Sprawl?
Yeah, what would you like to know?
This is your first
Um,
media appearance, so you can really. This is where you get to craft the narrative that will stick.
I was actually supposed to be on a major network today, but it got bumped. So this would have been my second, but this is way bigger than that being with you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, there's 9 people watching, so
Yeah, but I like you more
Um,
than the fake news media.
right. So it's
Just
a
kidding.
book about suburbs. What does that mean?
Right. Well, it's not about suburbs. It's about the idea of the suburbs, I think, more. I mean, yeah, I think it's kind of funny talking to people like you who aren't actually from, like, have you ever lived in a suburb in your entire life?
Never.
You're just like a straight city kid.
Unless, yeah, I mean,
Um,
Jersey City is the closest thing because it's like a suburb of New York, but it's a whole city, so it's
yeah.
not a suburb.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like I've lived in cities pretty much most of my life. But I grew up in the suburbs, and um, I hadn't really gone back to the suburbs much in the last. I hadn't gone back for about a decade, and then my wife's family lives in the suburbs of Connecticut, and we started going up there more. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm kind of liking this a little bit more than I used to. Um, and it just kind of got me thinking about like what it means to be from the suburbs, especially in America. Um, and just like what a strange idea the suburbs are, and how I'm always kind of fascinated by things that we just, as a culture, just sort of like scoff at and don't give
Hmm.
much thought to it. Like I wrote this article a few years ago for Esquire about Guy Fieri, who I made the argument. I'm like, I go to see films at anthology film archives, and I listen to like weird jazz records, and I have like weird taste, but like I still really love watching Guy Fieri. There's something incredibly comforting about him, and I started interviewing him, and I'm like, oh, this guy's actually secretly a genius, and I kind of get why
Ah.
I like him and why he's successful. And so I've always been kind of interested in these things that I feel like sort of just get shit on very this kind of easily. And the suburbs are like the one thing you just everyone makes fun of. Um,
It's not
People
like
who
being
live
from
there do.
it's not like being from the country where you've got some kind of like, you know, I don't know, rural cred, right?
Right. No, I mean, I even like you, like I met you, and I mean, as somebody who grew up going into New York City and going into Chicago his entire life, I automatically was like, oh, this guy's like almost 20 years ago. I remember this, like when I met you, I was like, oh, this guy's from the city. He's got to be very cultured, and you are obviously, but like he's cool and he's smart, and there's just that stigma if you're from the other, you have to really build yourself a little bit more, and in a lot of ways you do. I mean,
Yeah.
the city. I read the Beastie Boys book a few years ago, or last year, and they talk about like, oh, we could just run around the city, and we had all the museums, and we had all these cool things at our disposal, but in the suburbs you don't have any of that. And when you really start to think about all the stuff that has come out of the suburbs, and especially the last 50 years, and I started thinking about all the stuff I like, whether it be like David Lynch films or hardcore records from the 80s, um, a lot of these things wouldn't exist if it weren't for people having to find a way to make their own fun and make things that occupy their time.
I mean, it's
So
interesting.
just kind of wanted to dig deeper into why that is and how
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
I think
growing
it
up,
grows.
when I met people
Thank
from
you,
the
froze.
suburbs, huh? Sorry, you're skipping a bit.
What's that? I'm listening. Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
your thing was skipping a bit.
Is that
Yeah,
better?
you're seeing me. You're coming to me live from Discman, right?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Um,
Walkman.
yeah, it seems like people from the suburbs do have to work that much harder to kind of get culture and exciting things because it doesn't just come to their doorstep, right? So does that mean that people from the suburbs are better equipped when they
Yeah.
arrive in cities or stuff? Or are there still gaps in their kind of...
I'm gonna sit down. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm gonna put this down. Hold on. I've been holding this entire time. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think it just depends on the person, right? I mean, you could be from the city, and you could be the dumbest motherfucker on the planet. It doesn't. I don't think location like makes you a certain way. I think it's like if you're willing to dig and sort of look beyond where you're from, no matter where that might be. You're going to be a more creative and more curious person. It doesn't. I don't think location necessarily dictates that. I think everyone has that in them. It's what they want to get into. I mean, for me personally, and I think the one thing I will say about kids today is if I had the internet when I was a kid, it was like the process of finding things was so difficult to, I don't know. It was like if I wanted to find a record, you'd have to I'd have to get on one train. I'd have to like walk 40 minutes to get to a train. That train would take an hour and a half to get into the city, and then I'd find the records that I wanted and do it back again. So it was like a 7 or 8 hour trek to find 2 records.
Right.
And those records would become like the things that like changed my life. And then you'd read you do the thing that every like late Gen X, early millennial kid had to go through. You'd read the liner notes and you'd be like, oh, this band Born Against sounds cool. I've got to find out about them. Or, you'd buy one of the shitty Cro-Mags albums. To find this band. I need to hear this band. They're in Liturgy. But then you'd find out it's like one of the crappy Bad Brains albums.
Mm-hmm. Do you think of the Suburbs as
so I don't know if it's necessarily.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Do you think the Suburbs as a lonely place to grow up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was definitely pretty lonely in the suburbs. I just did a book club for this book called The Lonely City by Olivia Lang, and she focuses on people who are in the city. Like she wrote about like Warhol and Edward Hopper and Close Nomi and people who were making art and living in the city who were lonely people, and how the loneliness sort of like impacted their work. And that's what actually kind of got me thinking about this kind of like the loneliness factor in the suburbs. Like I kind of started thinking about it where it's like the suburbs make you lonely. Like it's just everything is so spread apart. In the city, it's like if you're a lonely person, you're a lonely person. If like that's who you are. But in suburbia, like you have to walk places. You have to, you might not care about your neighbors the way you care about them here. but there's also something kind of beautiful about it, you know. Just if you find like certain like there's just a lot of like big open fields and like weird stuff to discover in the suburbs, like unfinished construction sites and like weird things like that. And it kind of, I think that's where I think the suburban imagination really kind of takes on its own, like filling in the spaces.
It's interesting that you mentioned David Lynch, and he immediately springs to mind as someone who found that kind of imaginative world in the empty spaces of the suburbs. But he did so by sort of presenting the suburbs as a place that was kind of secretly perverse or kind of wicked behind its veneer. Do you think that's a kind of necessary juxtaposition to like explore in order to get interesting things out of the suburbs?
Who was it you said again? Who was it you said again?
David Lynch.
Oh yeah, I have an entire chapter on him, which I really, yeah, I have an entire chapter in the book on him, which I wrestled with even doing because David Lynch has been written about so many times, but he is. I mean, I do think like the idea of like Lynchian, you know, the Lynchian, like when people say, "Oh, that's so Lynchian." It's a suburban thing. I mean, you know, Twin Peaks is a lumber town in the Pacific Northwest, but it's incredibly suburban. I mean, it's everything about it is him kind of taking a piss out of that like post-war kind of soap opera, lily white sort of suburban idea, and he sort of. I mean, there are a few other people who came before him who I think were presenting this kind of like dark side of the suburbs, but he was the one who really just kind of, I mean, there are so many television shows and movies today that, and books that have that Lynchian tone when they're discussing the suburbs. And I think it is necessary. I mean, it's necessary to talk about the dark side of any place. Like if you hide from the dark side of anything, then I think you're fooling yourself. But the suburbs were built on this idea of escape and of you know, it's not the American suburbs, but you know that the Kinks song Shangri-La. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like it was supposed to be Shangri-La for people, and you know, it's not. Nothing is. The Lynches, I mean, I actually make a joke in the book. I'm like, I think I say something like, 1,000 essays about David Lynch have already been written, and I don't intend to write another one. But it's just impossible to not. Same thing though, like John Waters. He's another person I think whose worldview is really shaped by the boring Baltimore suburbs after the Second World War. You know, like people like that who we don't even think about as like suburban.
Right.
He's explicitly said, my boring suburban upbringing.
In both those cases, do you think? I guess both of them portray the suburbs as a kind of hypocritical place, a place where there's really like kinky weirdness happening. Do you think that's like unfair, or just too small a piece of the puzzle?
I think it's just hidden. I think kinky stuff is happening everywhere. I mean, I think actually in the Lynch in the chapter about Lynch, I mentioned a couple like 2 years ago, there was this video, or excuse me, there was a Zillow listing of this like McMansion in Philadelphia, like outside of Philadelphia, and they just didn't. They literally just took pictures, and I don't know if it was a joke or what, but they left up all the BDSM stuff. Like there was just like a whole like
I remember that
room for, yeah, and people were making a huge deal about it, and I'm like, would people be making a big deal about this if this was in the city? I don't think so, and I'm not gonna like kink shame anybody. People can do whatever they want. I just found it really interesting because I was like, this is because it's in the suburbs. It's in a McMansion. There's something sort of grotesque about it to people, and I mean, I think people are always looking. I think there's a healthy dose of fooling yourself, and not everyone does this. I mean, I know people who've moved to the suburbs because they're like, well, I could get a yard for my kids,
Mhm.
or I can get them in better schools, and I think that's totally respectable. But I mean, the idea of the suburbs was built on it's better, and you're better if you can make it here. And at the time when people were moving to the suburbs, the only people that could move to them were white people, mostly white Christians. Not, there were plenty of places that didn't allow Jewish owners or even, you know, immigrant Greek or German. So
Yeah, um, I wonder if one of the places where if it seems to me suburbs are, instead of being dismissed, are kind of romanticized, and this is a bit of what your last book, Searching for John Hughes, is about, is in teen movies. Teen movies always seem to take place in the suburbs, and they present this kind of rich inner life for a
yeah,
teenager at a suburban high school. I can't. The only movie about kids that I can think of set in New York is Kids, and it's like a horrifying picture about how horrible kids
yeah,
are. So why? I mean, why is that? Why is
yeah.
that such a big part of American film?
Um, I think like part of it to me, like I mean, Hughes especially, um, kind of. I mean, I've made the argument, and I don't think I'm the only one, but he's definitely in this lineage. He was trying in a lot of ways, or he was sort of like the '80s version of Frank Capra, where I think he was trying to sort of. Except Capra wanted to have like a message, like, "Oh, America's great. Americans are good people. This and that." Um, Whereas I think Hughes just was like, well, this is normal America. I want to present, normal kids in a normal town, which that was his idea of normal kids. It was white, upper middle class kids from the Chicago suburbs. And, that became a huge trope, like the white, upper middle class kid from the Chicago suburbs. And Hughes didn't start that. Like there was a film that won the Academy Award in '79 by Robert Redford. It was an adaptation of the book Ordinary People, and that was also in the Chicago suburbs. And uh, there was this movie Class, which I think was like considered like the beginning of the Brat Pack. That was in the Chicago suburbs, and I just think it's just
The
it was in the
Graduate is
middle.
kind of the Graduate's kind of a forerunner to that genre.
Yep, absolutely, and also like the Graduate also kind of toes that line between that kind of genre and then also sort of the dark side of the suburbs because it's around the same time as the film adaptation of John Cheever's The Swimmer, which is I don't know if you've ever. I mean, the story is incredible, but the movie is got Burt Lancaster in it. And it's a really great weird film. It's very creepy for its time. It's beautifully done, but that was like towards the end of the '60s. People were starting to slowly sort of explore that dark side. But then by the '80s, and I can't really speak to everything John Hughes thought or his political beliefs, but by the '80s, there was definitely this like rah rah, shining city on the hill. Reagan's going to return us back to Main Street USA, and no matter how much we want to like try to rewrite history, enough Americans were on board with that idea that Reagan got voted in by 49 states, I think, when he got reelected.
Yeah.
So I mean, Americans were really into that idea. It's really weird, but you gotta remember that's like our grandparents were really the driving force between that, behind that. It was like the baby boomers kind of getting to their like we're done with all the hippie stuff, now we're yuppies,
Mm-hmm.
and the greatest generation being like we want it back to the way it was. So it's weird, and I think Hollywood was reacting to it a certain way, and yeah, I mean, I made a joke in my first book. I was like, I think you can count on your hand the amount of black people in John Hughes movies, and one of them is the Michael Jordan cutout in Home Alone.
Yeah, that's true. Has
Yeah.
that view of the suburbs changed at all?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's like it goes back to what I was saying. It's like we don't what we call the suburbs. Like the suburbs is a lot of it's not one thing. There's not one like Brooklyn Heights was the first suburb. People don't really realize that. Like I live 15 minutes walking from what is the first suburb in America. It's no longer a suburb, but it once was. But I think the thing is, it's like you go to like if you go to Chicago, the inner ring suburbs around Chicago are Black, Latino, immigrant. I thought it was really interesting a few years ago, and it was tragic, but it was also really interesting that the narrative around when you saw that kind of like uptick in unarmed young black men being shot, like Trayvon Martin, the narrative wasn't these are taking place in the suburbs, but they were. Ferguson is a suburb. Those Orlando where Trayvon Martin was shot, the place where Trayvon Martin was shot is a suburb. It's a gated community. And that was really, I found that really interesting. And that was kind of part of the thinking in the book too. I was like, 52% of Americans consider themselves residents of suburbs. So that's over half of Americans. Yet we are really obsessed with this idea of like who lives in the suburbs and what the suburbs are when, the story isn't totally, clear. And it's also not being represented, honestly. There's, as I did my research for this book, I in one of the chapters is the reproduction of malls. There's one outside of Atlanta in the suburbs. There's a mall outside. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it has a huge Latinx population. Like a lot of people from Central America are living there. So some business owners basically took it and turned it into this like abandoned mall. They turned it into a place where people just moving here could set up little shops, and there were like things to sort of it's like a market in Central America except in a mall, and I find that really interesting. And you go to a place like Houston, and Houston has people from all over. The Houston is kind of like at the LA thing where it's a really big sprawling place, and there's a center of it, but there's so much suburbs. Houston is made up of a lot of suburban places, and there's a lot of people from South Asia, India. It's really interesting. So I'm trying to help change that narrative.
Well, speaking of Chicago's suburbs, the Pullman Porter company built homes for its black employees, and it's now a national monument in Chicago. Was that a suburb too?
That's more of a company town. I mean, that's not technically in the suburbs. That is, I believe, in Chicago proper. But it's also designated as the Pullman district, I think. I could be wrong about that. I mean, they made us
still live there.
Yeah, they made us visit it on a field trip when I was a kid. No, that's a little different. I mean, like throughout the Midwest and throughout the Rust Belt, a lot of towns. I think like Gary, Indiana, which is a city. I believe that was U.S. Steel. Hershey, Pennsylvania. I do think company towns, sort of like university towns, like are kind of they kind of are their own thing.
Mm-hmm. Is it safe to say then that there's a distinction to be made between what are technically suburbs and what people think of as suburban?
I think the definition of a suburb, the dictionary definition is an outlier. And that's kind of something I found really interesting because I personally always felt like an outlier in the suburbs. And I think a lot of people that live in the suburbs who end up leaving the suburbs do. And so I think that's the one term that I think unifies the suburban lifestyle and the suburbs as a place. They're sort of outliers. And I mean, you could live in the suburbs and you could be the most interesting person in the world. You know, I'm not going to like fault anybody for where they live or where they ended up, or I would never want to do that. I do think there is a suburban lifestyle. But the same could be said about cities or people who live in the country. You know, it's you know, your environment influences you a good deal. You know, but I think there are definitely two distinctions. But if you want to really buy into a certain kind of lifestyle, you know, you could definitely be a suburban person, just like you could be a city person and be totally fucking insufferable. You know, it's
Right.
you know, ruthless. What is it? Ruthless cosmopolitan.
Right. What's some of the literature of the suburbs? Goodbye Columbus springs to mind.
Yeah. Well, actually, so I have another chapter on that because as somebody who reads a good deal, you know, I'm kind of fascinated by. I kind of talk about this in this like interesting context where this context that was interesting to me, where you know I grew up. I think my first really big introduction to American literature was a lot of the post-war Jewish stuff. You know, Philip Roth, you mentioned Goodbye Columbus, and we had Saul Bellow. Like the spines of Saul Bellow books are very comforting to me. They remind me of my childhood. And so, like, when you think about all those writers, those are all these like Jewish people who, you know, as a Jew, I could say this: we weren't really well liked, and we still aren't, obviously, but it was different before my time. Like we weren't allowed. My grandmother used to tell us about like the country clubs our family wasn't allowed into and stuff like that. It's weird, but like, you know, in the post-war era, you started seeing American Jews sort of get this sort of a little bit more recognition. Like we were sort of, I hate to say it, but like they were accepted as white people essentially a little bit more.
Sure.
You know, it's kind of like, that's kind of like one of the things that always worries me is that Jewish people always get too comfortable, and then it's like, oh, we should have gotten so comfortable. But you know, I think like in doing that in the post-war era, we really started to sort of like we started sort of getting acceptance, and we started just becoming Americans. And the people who are writing about the suburbs today are almost exclusively from you know, fiction wise, are usually people of color or immigrants, and I find that really interesting. So Rakesh Sehgal, he had a book called Nobody Could Pronounce My Name. I write about him. I actually interviewed him for the book. Celeste Ng, whose Little Fires Everywhere was just turned into a show on Hulu. Mm-hmm. She's from the suburbs, and she writes beautifully about them. Caroline Waslawiak wrote a book. Oh God, I forget the name of it, but it takes place in this like gated Connecticut suburb, and again, it goes back to the Lynch thing. It had this very David Lynch feel to it. There's a lot of people writing about it, but it's weird because for years it was like the books about the suburbs were a couple of white dudes trying to understand the suburbs, like John Cheever, who was obviously like the sort of, and like Richard Yates. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of had this real Gen X thing where the suburbs were still being only written about by mostly white people, but it was sort of like, oh, the suburbs are such a bummer. You know, like Virgin Suicides, which I love the movie, the books, Dave Eggers, and now all of a sudden it's like it's a different. It's very telling to me that the people who are writing about it are first generation and immigrant or people of color, because they're experiencing the suburbs sometimes, you know, the first time. You know, it's this is America, and that's what they're experiencing. And I think there's something really telling and interesting about that.
That image of suburbia being the quintessential America seems to me very strong. Have you seen the show Sex Education on Netflix?
I'm good. I got to start watching it. I'm going to. I think this
Yeah.
week. I love Gillian Anderson.
It's very funny. Gillian Anderson's great. It's a hilarious show, but also it takes place in what looks like a John Hughes suburb, like cookie cutter, straight from there, but they're all English.
Yeah.
It's very, very weird. It's just, it has a sort of disconnect in my mind, but it's like when I watched it, I was like, growing up, this was how they always showed high schools, being this suburban, very John Hughes kind of thing. But it was in England. Mm. And I also know from experience that like other places have tried to copy American suburbs with varying success. In India, there are like sprawling suburbs outside of a lot
upon suburbs.
Right. That upper middle class and wealthy people live in, and they often have gates and stuff like that. And I've seen it in Africa too. Do you think that the American suburb has? First of all, do you know of anywhere where it's been like really successfully kind of built on or replicated or done right?
I mean, most of the biggest suburbs in the world are Taiwan and China, places, So I think they seem to have done a good job. I mean, there have been a lot of experiments on the suburbs. There have been different like green cities and things like that, which are technically in their own way suburbs. I think it could be a work in progress and one that actually could benefit us as a it could be great for humanity if the suburbs worked, but especially in America, I make a point of like really talking about Levittown on Long Island, which is the original the idea of the suburbs goes back like people getting out of the cities and going to their country homes goes back centuries, but the suburb as we know it is Levittown is sort of one of the kind of always looked at as the first, and you go there and it's like everything is just really tight. There are no sidewalks. There's just wires dangling. There's still an off-track betting. As a kid who grew up in New York, like OTB, it's like, and that to me symbolizes that it's like a lot of suburbs in America, especially, still look like that, and they're falling apart, and that's kind of sad. But I think if done right and if sort of like reconsidered, if we had more access to people, if streets, if houses weren't so far back, because that's always the thing that kind of blows my mind today is how far back houses are from the sidewalk, if there even is a sidewalk when you go to the suburbs, and how you have to drive everywhere, which definitely isn't great. Things like that, if they could be sort of like, if we could figure out how to fix those things, I do think there is something, the city's not for everybody. There is something good and healthy about space. We're learning that right now.
Yeah. I remember looking at the old posters for the London Underground when they first started building that out, and it was all about you can get out to these. I don't think they called them suburbs then, but you can get out to these areas and breathe fresh air. Yeah. It was about getting away from the smog of the city. And it was the idea, now that there's a railway to do it, an underground railway, anyone can do it. It's not just for the country gent.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of American urban planning, in cities and the suburbs, a lot of our ideas of like what we want America to look like come from the UK. I mean, the Village Green and the city gardens and all that kind of stuff. People like William Morris. A lot of his thinking, if you read a lot of William Morris's his writing, everyone knows him for The Wallpaper. Right. Big time socialist, great guy. You read a lot of his writing.
Great beard.
great. Yeah, you read a lot of his writing, and I mean, he was onto something that was very proto suburb. And you know, a lot of like the writing that predates what we today consider the suburbs is very utopian oriented. Like it's kind of beautiful, and like there was this idea that people could live in harmony by having this combination of modern like modern homes and modern things with nature as your backdrop. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. And, you know, I think that's why the happiest I've ever been living in New York, almost 9 years now, is I've lived across the street from Prospect Park, which Vox and Olmsted did. And they were very influenced by all of that and helped build helped develop some of the earliest suburbs in America as well.
Do you think it's interesting that you mentioned that idea about living in harmony with nature? Is there any connection between the idea of the suburbs and the I think sort of older idea of the commune, like you would have like in Hawthorne's Blithedale Romance or something like that?
I mean, I definitely do think there was definitely something of the pastoral written into the early ideas of the suburbs. One of the suburbs that I really like to write about and I'm kind of obsessed with is East Orange or West Orange. I always forget. I apologize if anybody from New Jersey is watching this, but it's Lewin Park, which is a gated community. Thomas Edison had one of his homes there. I think Whoopi Goldberg lives there today. It's if you go on the website, I mean, all it is about like how we're a community and we do all these things together, and you know, it's just rolling. It's off of a mountaintop. It's very beautiful from everything I could tell. And you know, there are other suburbs that sort of still today have that idea of like having community sort of baked into the idea, but it's so rare. Mostly, and this is how I sum up a good percentage, I would say, from everything I've read and observed, 75-80% of the suburbs in America, somebody bought some land, built some houses, built some townhouses, built whatever, and said, move in, it's a community. And that's it. They didn't really invest anything into it. And that's a shame, you know? I mean, communities develop, but the thing is, the reason I think why there's always this nostalgic idea of like the city being this, you know, you watch like a Spike Lee film and like there's the old woman yelling to like the downstairs neighbor, and you still see that in Brooklyn. I still see it sometimes, but you know, the idea communities develop, but when people are so tight like they are in the cities, it's a little easier to develop those cities. When you live in the suburbs and you're kind of spread apart, you know, I talk to these people who, one of the chapters is on this. I was kind of interested in this golf course by my wife's parents' house. There's, I think, 4 golf courses in the city that they live in, the suburb they live in. 4, which is very Connecticut. But I was really interested by the fact that there was this huge, this like big drive to save this one road. It was the Save Nod Road campaign. And it was because these developers wanted to build on the golf course. It wasn't so much about the golf course. It was more because the property would go on to protected wetland.
Okay.
And so I went to talk to these people, and like they were like, yeah, we've been neighbors for 15 years and we didn't even know each other. We just happened to have a Facebook post that we saw, and I'm like, you lived that close to each other for 15 years and you didn't, and that's normal. And I think that's like a really weird, you know, that to me at least, some, you know, who's lived an entire adult life now in cities, that's really strange.
Yeah, it's very strange. I couldn't even imagine that.
Yeah, but it's normal.
We've got about 10 more minutes, but I want to say one thing that springs to mind is a lot of contemporary television shows like Sopranos, The Americans, Breaking Bad are they're built on the premise that like the real crime is happening in the suburbs. And that's where the hardcore criminals are secretly living or something, because
it's not a secret. It's true.
For respectability.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you do find out about people with locking people in their basement and all kinds of shit like that.
I mean, I could talk all day about The Sopranos. I haven't watched The Americans. I really need to. Sarah was actually telling me I should watch it. But The Sopranos to me, I mean, as a first generation, not an Italian, obviously, but as a first generation person in my family, I found a lot about The Sopranos to be kind of weirdly familiar. Now that I mean, I know you've compared me to Tony Soprano, which was one of the great honors of my life today. But
He was
about
wearing
that
those
whole
tracksuits very well.
the tracksuit thing has been great. But I think that idea of sort of you get that McMansion it doesn't matter how gaudy it is, and that's reality TV. A lot of that's in the suburbs too. But and it kind of hides you behind it hides you up that really long driveway. Nobody can get to you up there. And then the most interesting parts of The Sopranos to me are the ones where like Tony's interacting with his neighbors, and where Tony's trying to come to grips with things like the wildlife in his coming into his like those are the little subtle things about that show that just kind of blow my mind and
Yeah.
and yeah.
Uh-huh. This might be the last question. Do you see your own future in the suburbs at all?
No. I mean, we just bought a place. We're buying a place in Brooklyn. It's like I said, I think next year, if you kind of factor in the time when I was a little kid, I think I've now lived in the cities, in cities more than I've lived in the suburbs. And my entire adult life has been spent in the city. So I just think it would be too hard. I mean, I couldn't do it.
Do you think that more people our age are looking to the suburbs for the first time, or looking to go back from?
Well, I mean, I talk about this a lot, and I think it's really fascinating. But I think the media just got a hold of this narrative that the cities were just like you saw. I mean, you had first growing up here and living here. New York is cleaner now, and there's more of this and there's more of that, but it's not like it's like literally overflowing with people. Like the whole idea is that the cities, everyone was moving to the cities.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really true. People who maybe want to pursue careers in art or in finance, or people who have reasons to move to the cities, and maybe in a lot of cases have the money to move to cities because cities have gotten really expensive, are moving to cities. But the numbers show that if millennials are able to buy homes, which is a difficult thing these days because they're all so busy eating their avocado toast. Sorry. They're buying in the suburbs, and it's really that's really interesting to me. But I don't know, they're not doing more to make the suburbs better. That's kind of the problem.
Interesting. I've often thought that about when I met people coming to New York in college, they were often really quick to kind of shit on where they came from, and I think it was just a way of distancing themselves from their past and trying to start fresh. And it always seemed kind of weird to me. But I think that now it seems like more people are saying, well, maybe you should go back and try to make those places better instead of there being a brain drain to all the cities.
Well, I mean, that is the problem. Like I said, like 52% of America is in the suburbs, and that's everybody. That's black, that's white, that's Muslim, that's Jewish, that's LGBTQ. It's everybody. I mean, the suburbs have everybody in them, and there's so many people in the suburbs, and so much of this country is concentrated in them that I don't think we have any choice but to sort of try to make it better. I mean, that's why every election, everything, you always hear about the suburban vote and the suburban this, and you know, it's like I said, like I was really heartened, like going, like Houston was really interesting to me because Houston is on its way to becoming the second biggest city in America. I think it's overtaking Chicago. But what's really interesting to me about it is that it's so sprawling in the the metro area, which includes its suburbs. Like I said, it's like, you know, you have families from all over Asia, from India. You have a lot of Muslim families there in Texas. And, you know, everyone's like, oh, Austin's the cool place. And to me, I'm like, Houston's great.
Huh. So. Yeah, I liked it when I went back and visited for the first time in ages. I was sort of oddly impressed with it, and it seems like in the same way that you're saying.
Yeah. It's very diverse. I mean, you know, I thought that was really cool. And, you know, I definitely wanted to make sure that I was pointing out very directly that yes, the suburbs were built on this idea that certain people have to be kept out. I mean, it was literally written into town charters that black people could not own property and that Jewish people could not own property, and sometimes Chinese people couldn't own property. Like that is, you could go to some suburbs if they keep their records around, and sometimes it was handshake deals, sometimes it was, but there are cities that would not, or suburbs that would not sell to people of color or people of certain religions, and it's baked into it. And I think the more we fight against that, I think it's a great thing to see that we can fight against that idea, because a lot of different people live in these places, and I think it helps to kind of show that, hey, we're all normal and we're all living. Anybody can live anywhere in America now. I mean, we're getting there. There are still places where,
sure,
even as a Jewish guy who could kind of just blend in, I think my neuroses would give me away. But if I don't open my mouth,
right,
I feel like somebody might just be like, "Oh, that Amish guy over there." But once I start talking, it's all just downhill.
That's when you start hearing the banjos.
Yeah, that's when but like, you know, but I do think it's nice that I would like to think, and from everything I've seen, the suburbs do kind of give this weird barometer of where we're going as a country. And I think that's good. I think that's a good thing. And I'm not telling anybody to move there if they don't want to. I'm not saying anything is better or worse. I'm just saying I think it gives me a little bit of hope. I don't have a lot of that these days, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Jason. When does the book come out?
End of August, I believe the 22nd, but you can pre-order it right now, which
Excellent.
You should.
I will.
Yeah.
Thanks for this, man.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun.
I had a lot of fun with you, too.
I can't wait till we can do this again in person.
One day. We'll get there.
Yeah. Night, night.